Thank you all for joining our carbon equity webinar on the hard thing about climate hardware investing. Appreciate you joining us once again for a new webinar, a topic I'm personally very excited about because climate investing very much revolves around hardware versus traditional VC investing. And we'll talk a lot about the differences between software and hardware investing and how hardware investing can drive outsized financial returns. Before we dive into all of that, let's set a few expectations. So today we're not going to be talking about carbon equity or our funds specifically. I'll give a brief introduction, but if you want to learn more about those, feel free to learn more, request more information through the website, or check in with any of the carbon equity team members after the webinar. If you want to, sorry, Sebastian, yes.
Now I can hear you.
Okay, good. So feel free to enter your name in the chat if you want, so that you can introduce yourself, your name, your role, and any questions that you may have. Feel free to post them in the Q&A section. At the bottom or at the top of your screen, you will find a Q&A section where you can list your questions, and we will seek to answer all of these either in person, live in the webinar, or in writing. And if we don't get through all of the questions, then we will try to answer these after the fact. So very briefly, we'll be talking about a very brief introduction on carbon equity. Our wonderful speakers, Laurie and Sebastian. I'm joined here by my co-host, Lisa Rubenstein, co-founder and chief impact of Carbon Equity. And my name is Jacqueline van den Ende, one of the co-founders and the CEO of Carbon Equity. Before we dive into the mode of today's discussion, a few words on carbon equity for those people who are new and don't know what carbon equity is just yet. Carbon equity is a climate, venture capital, and private equity fund investing platform. And we make it possible for private individuals to invest in dozens, up to hundreds of some of the world's most innovative climate technology solutions alongside world's best professional investors. Very specifically, what that means that we do is that we select out of a landscape of over 800 global climate, venture capital, growth, and private equity funds, the world's top funds, let's say the top 5% of funds who, first of all, are best in class in delivering material climate impact, and secondly, can combine doing so with delivering attractive financial returns. We recently launched a very special fund, the Climate Tech Portfolio Fund. That's our flagship fund, which allows you to invest in 150 to 200 climate technology companies, everything from super innovative air conditioning to electrified steel production to carbon-free cement or plant-based food. So every solution under the sun that we need to get to net zero. And we do so through 7 to 10 wonderful leading climate venture capital growth and buyout funds. So it offers you exposure to the whole climate technology theme with ample diversification. And obviously, we do so digitally through a platform. And we have recently launched this fund. It's now 50 million in size. We're targeting a close at 100 million by end of this year. And what is very exciting is that we have made 2 first fund selections, meaning these are funds that have gotten through, that have ended up on top of these 800 funds that we have reviewed. And we're very proud to announce these funds and obviously to have them in our webinar. So I'll introduce our fund managers in a moment. Laurie Menuut from at One Ventures and Sebastian Heitman, founding partner of Extantia Capital. In this webinar, we're going to be talking about hardware. Well, we might also be talking about software innovations, but the focus is really on hardware. And it's super interesting because traditionally VCs have really focused on software investing, software as a service, marketplace type models. But to transition from our fossil fuel era to a true net zero future, we are without a doubt going to need huge investments in climate hardware, because we need to not only rewire the digital economy, we especially need to rebuild our physical, our real economy. And hardware investments are incredibly important because they offer direct and very tangible impact on the environment, especially in certain sectors that cannot decarbonize in a purely digital way. So think about heavy industry, chemicals, steel production, manufacturing, aviation, shipping, buildings. All of these are things that we will not be able to decarbonize in a purely digital way, and we're going to need hardware innovations such as carbon capture and storage, biofuels, electrification technologies, biochemistry. So tons of hard science needed to solve these big problems. Hardware innovations are super exciting. If you look at a couple of the first, hardware gigacorns or unicorns, such as Tesla that we all know, but also Enphase Energy, NVIDIA, and part of climate company Sunrun, all listed companies that are valued in the billions. These have obviously returned outsized financial returns. At the same time, scaling hardware solutions can also be incredibly hard. They often involve very large capital investments. They often have to deal with complex supply chains and lower margins than software. So how do you invest in hardware in a successful way is what we're going to be discussing. So we're going to be discussing in this webinar, why it is so important to be investing in climate hardware, what the differences are between hardware and software investing, how hardware investments create impact value and financial value, and what the unique challenges are of scaling climate hardware innovations. And finally, very interested to get an inside view on how our fund managers are evaluating climate hardware investments. How do you evaluate these type of companies? So for that, we have invited two, really rock star climate fund managers. Lori, she's a very special person. She is a real scientist, has a master's in biotechnology. Not many of us can say that. And something that I really love about the climate industry, there are so many scientists, not just financial engineers, but actual engineers who are solving these big problems. She started her career as a biochemist and as a microbiologist. She worked in corporate research and corporate venturing with a couple of big chemical companies such as Solvay and BASF. And she was a venture and innovation manager at the Stanford Research Institute, already investing in these types of hardware innovations before becoming a co-founder at One Ventures in 2020. So lovely to have you, Lori. Thank you for joining us. And our second guest is Sebastian Heidmann. Sebastian is a self-proclaimed gigacorn hunter and doing very well at that. He is one of the co-founders and obviously a founding partner of Extantia Capital. Sebastian himself is a former entrepreneur, so has a lot of experience himself in scaling companies and has worked in a range of industries from sports to community building to software. And he has received his education from Harvard Business School and currently lives in Berlin in Germany. Welcome, Sebastian. And to kick off the conversation, Lisa, may I give the word to you?
Absolutely. Yeah, great to have you both on. Let's kick it off with a little bit about your funds and what your funds do. So Lori, could you tell us a bit more about @ONE and specifically what you think makes your investment thesis unique?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for the invitation and of your support, of course. So at One Ventures, we are a venture capital firm based in San Francisco. Our mission is to help humanity become a net positive to nature. So it's not only about becoming net zero, it's really about thinking about how humanity can thrive by producing basically what we need while giving back to the planet. Because when you see the current trend in terms of temperature increase, I mean, if we were to stop all of the carbon emission today, we will not go back to the temperature at pre-industrial level. So we really need to cut our emissions, but also make sure that the planet can absorb those carbon emissions. So that's our focus. And concretely, we target deep tech companies, so hardware, but more specifically hardware coming out of the lab. So can be robotics, can be synthetic biology, can be AI, and deep tech that are going to disrupt the unit economics of the industries damaging the planet. So we've invested in 35 companies so far across a bunch of sectors you mentioned earlier, Jacqueline. So not only energy and transportation, but also steel making, also agriculture, building, cement, those topics that are kind of untapped in the VC sector. We started operating back in 2020, as I mentioned, 35 companies, and we've raised across two funds $500 million.
Fantastic. And Laurie, I think that your focus on unit economics is something that sets @ONE apart, or at least you talk about it a lot. Could you share an example from your portfolio, an investment you're proud of that shows how these unit economics work in practice?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, unit economics to me is critical. I've been part of the clean tech 1.0 era back when I was in the chemical industry in 2010. And back then, many of the clean tech companies failed because they had challenging unit economics. What I mean by that is that people around the world, I think, more and more care about the planet, but we still live in a capitalistic world. And ultimately, we need to find solutions that are going to be economically viable for their customers, including industrial companies. I mean, if you look at the chemical industry, steel industries are all very cost sensitive. So our focus is to find deep tech companies that are developing solutions that are at least at cost parity with incumbent technologies. An example, we invested in a company called Ascend Elements, invested at a very early stage. It's now a unicorn. We are raising a $600 million Series D round at the moment. And this company, what they are doing is using and taking end-of-life lithium-ion batteries, recycling them, and producing cathode active materials. Because they are using end-of-life batteries and recycled metal contents, their cathode material is actually 35% lower cost than a brand new virgin cathode material. And for automakers, there is a big shortage of metals at the moment in the supply chain. So for them, having kind of secure availability of cathode material at a lower cost is just a no-brainer. So thanks to that, we've been able to sign a $1 billion contract with one of the top 3 EV maker, cannot share the name. It's just to demonstrate, I mean, in just 2 years, the company went from lab stage to signing a $1 billion contract with a top customer. And that's because of their superior unit economics.
Wow. We'll definitely talk more about how you find those companies. But first, Sebastian, would love to hear what Extantia does.
First of all, hi, I have a bit of voice today, but I'm happy to meet all of you, and thanks for inviting me and being now part of the Carbon Equity family. So looking forward to more exchanges like this in the future. Extantia Capital, we started sort of in 2018-19 in our minds, but really started to get to work towards the end of 1920. From the diverse backgrounds. I mean, there were 3 initial founding partners, soon complemented by 2 others, so 5 altogether. What we were all had our experiences in different types of situations on the clean tech journey already. I started very early my clean tech journey in 2006-07 with the early boom of the clean tech 1.0 era, that Laurie just mentioned, and continued on. So the ups and downs of that era. Yair was working back then for a German family office that was one of the first LPs to what today is known as Breakthrough Energy Ventures, so which was the first fund out of the US moving into the opening a new era kind of after Paris Agreement.
Maybe for the people that don't know, that's the fund that was started by Bill Gates.
Yes, exactly. Sorry, yes. Bill Gates and a few other prominent ones like Jack Ma and John Doerr and some people who've been around for some time. That got us sort of together. Also a little bit learning from what Breakthrough did not do, frankly. We were all about actually mobilizing capital towards climate. And that for us always felt a bit like a billionaires club, because there was no institutional money involved, it was only really rich people getting together. So that motivated us to create the new asset class of climate tech. Because for us it was clear that we have to make this a normal available asset class to the institutional investor as well as the private individuals as well, of course. So this democratizing what carbon equity doing is very much down our alley. That's how we see that we really can make a dent for climate. In terms of what we do, it's not so different from what Laurie just mentioned as well. I mean, we are very thesis-driven investor. We look for two things, essentially speed and scale. And at the end of the day, we want to see that companies have a potential to at least reduce 100 megatons of CO2. That's our threshold, which is quite high. That's like 20% of an industrialized country like the UK. And the other thing is we wanted to see fast impact. We call this the time value of carbon concept. So a ton of CO2 that we can remove or abate today has a lot higher value of that happening in the year 2040 or 50. In combination, those two things lead you to investment thesis where you predominantly invest into hardware, because size you will not reach with software, and B, predominantly retrofit. So we actually don't like new build structures. We really invest into technology that can retrofit into a bolt onto existing infrastructure or leverage existing infrastructure. What they also have in common with our friends from One, we also have co-investment, so we know each other for a bit, is that we try to solve this, what we call the trilemma. The technology today, she mentioned as well, needs to be, of course, the unit economics need to be superior, and nothing scales. That's not really profitable. So when people always ask me, are you an impact investor? It's like, no, actually not. That's the wrong word. We invest with impact, but not for impact. So it's because otherwise it always feels like we're doing it just for the impact, and there's no impact without really strong unit economics, like she mentioned. But also nowadays companies need to solve three challenges. They need to be the economically most viable option, the ecologically most viable option, and nowadays also the resilience is a huge topic. Like you also mentioned, the recycling or circular economy technologies play a huge role in creating resilient economies. So any company we invest into needs to solve the trilemma. So it's not, we don't make it easy for the entrepreneurs.
Doesn't sound like you make it easy. So the best tech, the best impact, the best resilience, and also a retrofit rather a new build. Could you give an example of a company that meets all of these criteria?
Every single one from our portfolio does meet that criteria, clearly. Maybe a beautiful one we've invested out of the current fund where you guys are in as well now is a company producing a highly versatile reactor that don't make it too technical, too complicated. Sort of, has two ways of operating: a gas to power and power to gas, and a highly reversible operation at a very high efficiency. So it's able to transform gas into electrons to feed to the grid as a prosumer. And it does it with double the efficiency of the previous mechanism. The current internal combustion engine has about 40% efficiency of turning gas into electrons. They do it at 80%. So that's already a huge impact. On the other hand, in the reversible, like I mentioned, operation, they are able to create storage gases like methane or hydrogen from electrons. So in the exact same. So what it does, it works constantly in the grid 24/7, doing either prosumer or consumer to the grid. And this bolts on into any existing gas utilizing structure. The first case they're building is biogas, but it really changed the game for biogas. As an asset owner, you 5 to 10x your EBIT from what you previously had. So the economic argument is clearly there. The ecologic argument is also clearly there. We are much cheaper and also carbon negative producing energy or producing storage gas, which is not from fossil origin. So the ecologic argument is there. And the resilient argument is also very clearly there because we are producing this decentral from our own waste. Biogas is typically produced from household waste as well as agricultural waste. So And it bolts on. It's a simple containerized solution that anyone can install in its asset. There's no limitations. And it's pretty much a retrofit which you install in 2 hours, and then you're up and running. So that's a classic example.
And maybe for final context, the carbon negative comes in because you capture whatever CO2 is produced when burning the gas, right?
No, it's actually not. There's no burning involved. So it's a solid oxide fuel cell at heart, which has, then there's two parts in the process where CO2 is extracted. It depends on what you do later on. If you do create methane, yeah, instead of hydrogen, which is often the better use case because hydrogen kind of decentral is a bit of a problem. It's different if you're like in Denmark and you have large central, like several 100 megawatts large even biogas plants, then it's a different story. Then you can have a good use case for hydrogen. But typically the easy way is to create methane because we have an existing methane grid that we can simply store stuff in. And then you would actually use the previously captured CO2 from the biogas to create methane. Because you need the C in it again, right?
Yeah.
Make the hydrogen stable. Hydrogen itself, I guess, is a bit unstable. So, but it is if you're producing hydrogen, it's highly carbon negative. Actually, it's 400 grams per kilowatt hour negative on CO2. That's quite a lot.
That's very exciting. Maybe for everybody to understand kind of the scope of what we're talking about, is there a very brief way you can summarize what climate hardware is or nature positive deep tech? Like what are we talking about and what are we not talking about? Laurie, could you give you?
So our perspective is maybe a bit broader than many climate investors in the sense that we just don't focus on CO2 emission. We basically look at water, air, soil, and biodiversity, and deep technologies that are going to help restore or help reduce the emissions or negative impact from those different categories. Because ultimately, if we want to fight climate change, it's not only about reducing CO2, it's about restoring those ecosystems that are going to capture the carbon. So for us, it's really deep tech across water, air, soil, and biodiversity with superior unit economics.
Yeah, clear. And my favorite question to ask, how do you define whether an investment has enough impact potential for your fund?
So we have internally what we call the total addressable environmental impact. And a bit similarly to what Sebastian mentioned earlier, we also have a threshold. So for carbon emissions, we are looking at a reduction of minimum 200 million tons per year, meaning that we look at the solution of the company, and similarly of the calculation you will do for a total addressable market, we do it for the potential of this specific company in terms of reducing the carbon emissions if all of their customers were to use the solution. So that's what we do for CO2, and we do the same, for example, for water consumption, for biodiversity preservation, and our threshold in that case is a reduction of 50% at least an impact of 50%. Yeah.
And what is the reason @ONE focuses on hardware rather than software, or deep tech, as you call it?
So what was the question?
What is the reason that the fund focuses on hardware? Is that because of the potential, or?
It's big. My belief is that, I mean, we've damaged the world physically. I mean, when you look at steel making, when you look at agriculture and deforestation, all of those damages have been physical. And I believe we need physical solutions to heal the planet. So that's why we focus on hardware. And then there are also financial reasons. There are many, many software investors out there. I think there is a unique opportunity in terms of investing in hardware, because you need specific expertise. Not everyone can make investments in hardware, especially early stage. So I think from a pure financial perspective, there is a great opportunity there to make big returns for investors.
And what is that unique opportunity? How would you describe it? You say there's a unique opportunity to invest in hardware?
Yes.
How do you see that opportunity?
In the sense that there are many companies, I mean, many technologies out there. You need to have specific expertise in terms of assessing those technologies, assessing those hardware companies. And so you need specific skills for that. And so all of the climate investors and climate funds that are being set up, some have very good expertise. I mean, Extantia is one of them, and we've invested together. Some have less expertise. So that's why I think it's from our perspective, less competitive world, and an opportunity again to make very interesting investments, especially early stage where the valuations are much lower and much crazier than software. I think software today, seed stage, I mean, especially when you look at generative AI, for example, it's to the roof.
Yeah.
You have seed stage companies with valuation above $100 million. It's definitely not something you see in hardware climate at an early stage.
That's such a good point, that there are much fewer funds who have the expertise and also a little bit, I would say, perhaps the courage or the stomach to do hardware investments. And that gives you a lot of moat when you do have that kind of expertise and really understand the dynamics of hardware investing, that you play in a much less competitive space, which is super interesting. Speaking about those financial returns, Sebastian, I don't know if this is totally private, but what would be sort of your target financial return for Extantia?
In this case, we are very boring, I would say, almost. I mean, we don't make any concession because we are investing into something that's good. Yeah, we always say our mantra is fixing the climate is good business. So that's a kind of our Constitution 1.1. It's good business, and therefore normal venture capital style returns, which is we're targeting a 30% IRR. Again, for us, there should be no concession to profitability on climate. Yeah.
Yeah. And what would you say are sort of the key drivers that make hardware investing financially attractive? Like in software, and typically you talk about a very strong gross margin because you have one product and you can duplicate it without any sort of marginal cost increases. And hardware has very different mechanics because more capital involved, and when you have to duplicate a machine, you actually need materials to build that second machine, so less scalable. What are sort of the unique, financial elements that make hardware investing also financially attractive?
I mean, it's what I mentioned going into it. It needs to solve this trilemma. And of course, it needs to be tech. We don't invest into deployment cases. So it needs to be this enabling technology that enables a lot of people later on developing projects to do this extremely more efficient than they've done this before. And it's like more ecologically and economically more viable than the previous solution. So which in our world means the fossil fuel solution. Yeah, this is reality. We're always trying to battle the fossil fuel price of any product at the end of the day. So our entire economy runs on hydrocarbons, and any product that wants to be competitive needs to beat that hydrocarbon price. But in terms of hardware specifically on the scaling factor, of course, it's hardware doesn't. I mean, hardware also over time scales quite well as you build economies of scale, but of course never like software. That's also clear. Where you mentioned it, it's the additional cost is quite a bit lower. But margins can be interesting in hardware. Unlike software, competitive, it's not that easy to replicate. What we like most about the hardware or the stuff that we invest into is we actually invest into a proven market. We are not investing into a market where we have doubts or question marks if this is actually a solution that the market wants. So in a lot of software investments, you have to bet on consumer behavior change. Who would have thought that we'd like to write our message with 140 characters only? There's a lot of consumer behavior change, belief behind it. Typically, the things that we invest into, once they hit the point where they solve the trilemma, the market is not a question. The market is the largest market there is out there, which is the market for the general industry and energy market. So that's a good price to have, at least. That if you do end up scaling well and you can solve the problem, then and at least no question marks there.
So if I hear you well, massive potential markets, more defensibility, less easy to replicate.
Yes.
Sort of hardware, deep tech IP, good margins. And I like specifically your thesis where you say we invest in retrofits, not necessarily getting companies to adopt entirely different systems, but really retrofitting existing systems to decarbonize them, which makes adoption of these solutions a lot easier.
I think it's key, to be honest, for two reasons. You mentioned it's a financial reason. rebuilding everything is just extremely costly, and a lot of stranded assets as a result from it, which is never a good idea. The other really important reason for retrofit is very often underestimated, I think, is the embodied carbon emissions. If you build new infrastructure today with today's carbon emissions, you have a long time to pay this back, a very long time. Because just large, I always take the example of it might sound like a great idea to build a train from Berlin to Amsterdam or something, yeah. But until you build the train tracks and all the bridges and tunnels and so on and put the trains on it, this train will need to run for a very, very long time in order to pay back the emissions that we've spent now on building all this infrastructure. And that time we don't have, actually. It's what I meant earlier with the time value of carbon. This speaks against it. So we actually look at this very thoroughly in our analysis, and we have actually a specific person on board to calculates this for us, our head of carbon math, professor. He's a professor at the University for Whole Life Carbon in the UK, in Cambridge and in Edinburgh. And this is his job in our fund to calculate this, to make sure that we don't make this mistake, because it's actually a quite common mistake that's made, to not be diligent of the embodied carbon emissions. So our goal is by 2030, each technology we invest into needs to be net negative, and needs to be on a net zero level, break-even level in terms of the embodied carbon. So it needs to be net reduced
of an investment that is net zero in terms of embodied carbon, to give this a little bit, to visualize this for our audience.
I mean, all of them have to, yeah. I mean, again, not all of them are super CAPEX heavy. A lot of them are containerized solutions that, they emit something, but not crazy. But yeah, any technology we invest in we will see how much emissions will we emit until we finally able to actually reduce. And if that point of this net zero point, this break-even point is in the year 2040, then it's for us too far away. Then we say the solutions need to come in earlier and faster, which also has to do with the profitability. We're 10 plus 2 year fund life. So we try to invest into technologies that when they graduate from our portfolio, they're actually ready to market. So we maybe also shy away from things that need very large amounts and very long time to develop. For example, the next generation of hydrogen airplanes, until that actually flies and is certified and stuff. It'll be a long time. It'll need several hundred millions. Typically not our investment target.
Yeah, exactly. So no nuclear fusion, hydrogen planes.
No fusion, no hydrogen planes, nothing like that. I mean, fusion is fascinating, and I hope it will come. And personally, I'm invested. But from the fund perspective, fusion is out of scope for us. Yeah.
Jacqueline, I would love to just go back quickly on the question around financial return in hardware climate, because as GP of our funds, in talking to many limited partners, I think it's a common concern among investors. Is there a potential financial return with hardware? Hardware is hard, CAPEX intensive. Yes. I mean, Cleantech 1.0 was a big failure. So I just did some quick search online, because I think the data just talk by themselves. And I just wanted to share quickly to everybody here some data about Cleantech hardware versus regular software investments. Can you see my screen?
Exactly.
Yes.
And if you click on slideshow, we see your full screen. Yeah, perfect.
Yes, full screen. So the graph you can see here are data compiled by Cambridge Associates. Cambridge Associates, it's a global investment firm. They work for many endowments, pension funds, family offices, and basically recommend investments to them. And what they did here was compiling data, so internal return rates of funds investing in what they call kind of broad PVC universe versus Cleantech. And as you can see here, yes, back in 2007, between 2007 and 2012, Cleantech 1.0 crash, yes, the IRR were pretty bad in the Cleantech world. But look at what happened the years after. I mean, if you just look at 2017, actually the IRR was higher for Cleantech compared to the average VC, PE type of investments. So there is a proof here that investing in clean tech, in hardware, can make high financial returns for the investors. And when you look just at the last 3 years, so since 2020, there has been close to 300 exits of clean tech and climate tech companies through acquisition and IPO. And there is roughly $400 billion of total enterprise value for those companies since 2020. So it's actually very large. And just sharing real quick, I don't want to go too deep into our financial performances. We started 3 years ago, investing almost only in hardware. So we invested with our first fund in 26 companies. One is a software company, the rest are all hardware. After 3 years, we have a net IRR of 50%. And you can see on the right that the typical J curve for VCs, typically after 3 years, you have negative IRR. We have a very positive one. So again, just a proof that it works. And after 2 years, we have 2 unicorns. Yeah. So really just showing here that there is really a path to make large financial returns with hardware climate, and we need more investment in the sector. There are lots of very, very strong companies and they need help. They need money.
I can second that totally. And also what you just mentioned, Laurie, the flattened J curve we also see in climate tech in many funds actually. It's quite a bit flatter J curve. And also sometimes it's about helping the entrepreneurs often we're dealing with very technical entrepreneurs, right? Who are not maybe the most business savvy people. And this is where we come in and help them as well to come up with a model that the financial world also understands. Often the engineers would produce unit 1, 2, 4, 8 and sort of slowly replicate what they're doing. And what we've done in some cases where it's feasible, where companies were mature enough, we help them with the kind of like Tesla style pre-order model where they can get actually prepayments from customers when and have some type of bit more than MOU in your hand. And showing a strong financial performance. We had one company, actually the company you mentioned early on, the biogas company that did this and managed to do 100 million booked revenue within 8 months, roughly. That's also very unique about climate tech hardware. You have these opportunities to Tesla has shown as well. If you call it a climate tech company or not, I would probably not, but it's there are these options as well to use to make it look like more software style investments where the curve is like this.
Yeah, exactly. Taking one question from the audience, one of our members of our audience is asking, and reminder to, if you have questions, ask them in the Q&A so we can get to them. But what climate tech hardware investments fit the traditional VC 10+2 model and which don't? So we briefly touched upon this, Sebastian, that hardware often has a longer time span, especially deep tech coming out of university has quite a long lead time. First need to develop the technology, then need to commercialize, quite some big investments now needed to then actually get to scale. So to what extent does hardware investing fit that traditional timeline of a VC story, and what doesn't fit that timeline in your point of view?
In our case, when we invest at the seed stage, we invest in companies that are at what we call late lab bench, meaning that they've fully de-risked the science and after the round are going to focus purely on engineering risk. Meaning that sometimes those companies have maybe been around for 5-7 years in the lab, getting grants from the government to kind of de-risk the science. And typically, when we invest at that stage, if they have the right unit economics, there is a path to scale as fast as a software company. Because I think the big difference between hardware and software company is very easy to set up, very easy to get to your first customers and to your first revenue. Can take less than a year, basically, to build an app on a phone and to get the first revenue. But once you have those first revenue and those first customers, for them to scale to $100 million of revenue, takes actually the similar amount of capital as hardware. Again, as I mentioned earlier, Ascend Element, when we invested in the company, they were late lab bench. For them, it had been 7 years that they were working in the lab, developing the technology. And in just 2 years, they've been able to build the largest lithium recycling facility in North America, generate, I mean, we are on a path this year, we generate $60 million in revenue, and we have a $1 billion contract signed with a top customer in just 2 years. So there is definitely a path to scale very fast with hardware climate. But again, you need really to focus on the right unit economics for those companies.
Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. In preparing for this webinar, we did our homework, we did some research, kind of like what are now the top things that make hardware, VC, climate tech, hardware investing different from software, and what are specific challenges you get to deal with that might be less applicable to software. I will name all 5 of them, but then I'm happy to hear from the 2 of you whether one of those 5 you think is the biggest, or if you would name another one. But first there's the engineering risk, right? Laurie, you mentioned it. Maybe it works on a small scale, but how will you produce it in a large scale? Can you figure that out? There's something around time to market, though I've already heard it can actually be really fast, but typically sometimes you still need to build factories and that might take time. There's cost to scale, just a massive CAPEX sometimes needed to build those factories, and really curious to hear your view on that, especially in our current higher interest rate environment. A lot of sources talk about the marginal costs, where this idea that if we do SaaS investing, then every product we can sell for pretty much nothing, every additional product. That's different with hardware because you have to make the stuff. So does that make companies potentially less profitable? And there's some references to longer sales cycles that what we hear in the literature is that typically hardware might be more B2B business, meaning it might be harder to get it sold. But Sebastian, maybe you want to kick us off. Would you pick one of these 5 or another one?
I would actually pick another one, to be honest. I mean, all 5 are challenges for sure, but I think the at least also in the current global environment, the largest challenge that we see is managing the supply chain. That can be complicated and daunting for young entrepreneurs on a global market to manage quality, manage timing, manage cost on a global level. And we've seen quite a few famous supply chain disruptions right over the last couple of years, and the world is not getting easier in this sense at the moment. So that's actually what we see our entrepreneurs face most challenge with right now: supply chain security, or stability. Yeah.
And how does that then affect, I think, 1, your due diligence, but also 2, how you're helping the companies you're already invested in?
Yeah, on the due diligence, you would love to find these problems, but of course you don't. So these are the realities that you need to help the entrepreneurs with once you are invested. And each case is so individual that you can't generalize it. They all look for different parts as well and solutions. And so we have some procurement specialists in our advisory board that we could potentially point to them. Other than that, of course, what we sometimes it's very simple. Just having been in the situation before, I've also run a hardware company for quite some time. Sometimes you just got to be smart about things, If you can buy 30 units, you might also be able to buy 300. Typically, the entrepreneurs would be on the sort of frugal side and don't think we're going to need this. So we say, spend, do take in the more parts and have some leftover stock to it's probably not your biggest problem. So sometimes just having been in the situation before, sometimes we can connect them with an expert. But I mean, this is hard to navigate. I mean, hard to predict where these problems will occur. It's just general mindset, be prepared. The supply chains are complicated to navigate. And I think that's all we can do for them on that part right now. We can't manage for them the supply chain. They need to manage themselves.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. It's really interesting. Laurie, what would you say is the biggest challenge?
It's a bit similar to what Sebastian mentioned, and actually one of the challenge you mentioned. I think the cost to scale and in general manufacturing scale up is one of the biggest challenge of those companies. First, because most of those companies, as Sebastian mentioned, founders often come from academia or have engineering background, but have never really built a manufacturing line. So you need to bring the right expertise on board. I mean, building a kind of a large biotech fermentation line or a large battery manufacturing line is not that straightforward. So it requires specific skills and kind of a network among suppliers, among, for example, contractors that not everybody has. So that's one challenge. And then the cost to scale.
Yeah.
I mean, those plants are very expensive. We are talking hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of millions of dollars, when you look at the steel industry, for example. So where is the capital coming from? And for many of those companies, I mean, some are raising equity for that. I think equity is very expensive to build those plants. So you have to be smart about how to find the right financing structure. And for example, in the US, I'm less familiar with Europe, but in the US, there are lots of grants available for companies. So for example, again, I'll take the example of Aston, but they are very advanced. They're already commercial and manufacturing scale. They receive $500 million from the Department of Energy in grants to build their first facility. You also have the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. It's $400 billion of grants, tax credits, and loans for climate tech companies. And so having people in their team or even on our side in the VC firms to help them navigate those governmental organizations and access the capital is really critical. It's challenging, but feasible. So I think it's an area definitely where we need more support in the sector.
Yeah, I fully agree. Absolutely. And we are very adamant about that as well, by the way, on doing this right from the very beginning. Because even on your prototype or your first of a kind plan, you need to have the right mix of equity and non-dilutive financing, be it a grant, be it a loan, or whatever it be. We typically require that companies take at least 50% of a first of a kind plan to non-dilutive financing, just also to set them up for the future project finance, which is obviously later on the goal, right? Like I mentioned earlier, the companies graduating from our fund should be ready for project or infrastructure finance. So I agree that that's really something you need to work with the entrepreneurs on their business plan from day one. And they're not often so used to it. The other big challenge, which was not mentioned also in the challenges that what we see also a lot is hiring. Hiring is tough. And specifically we often have to hire a lot of blue collar workers, where our network tends to be very limited. But blue collar make a big difference in climate tech. You need people to actually, like, we always say CO2 is a molecule. You can't blockchain it away, meaning it's hardware, it's physical stuff. You need people who actually build things, and these are often not easy to find.
And it's a pretty tight labor market at the moment. Maybe just looping back to the CAPEX question for one more second, because the IRA was a big game changer in the US. Indeed, 400 billion on paper, but no cap on it. Some people think it might end up being more than $1 trillion.
Yeah.
At the same time, interest rates have increased quite sharply. And another big change I think that happened in the US is the Silicon Valley Bank going through a major upheaval, which was one of the primary venture debt vehicles for a lot of climate startups. So Laurie, I'd love to understand, did all of this CAPEX funding get harder over the last 12 months, or what is it currently like?
For venture debt and equipment financing, it's more expensive now because, as you mentioned, the interest rates are higher. That being said, there are still as many, except, minus Silicon Valley Bank in terms of venture debt providers. So typically for our companies, we were using SVB early on. So SVB was kind of providing venture debt and loan already at the seed stage. So often our company were getting maybe $500,000, $1 million, maybe up to $2 million from SVB. But as they were scaling, we were talking to other type of players. You have, I can name a few: Avenue Capital, Trinity Capital, Farm and Street Capital. Those are firms dedicated and focused just on venture debt for startups. And so they're still providing very large loan to the companies. So still companies we are using for the portfolio. That's one. And then trying to leverage now more grants and the IRA. There is also in the US the LPO loan from the Department of Energy, which is a loan provided at treasury rates. Very, very interesting for later stage company where they need to start building plants.
Yeah. Great.
And Sebastian, is it harder in Europe to get these projects funded, these early stage projects?
Also, not yet, I would say. No, we've actually seen actually the number of non-dilutive funding going up quite sharply over the last sort of year. As also similar to the US, more programs become available. Also, there are good talks to even increase this now quite significantly. EIB is putting together now a new venture debt program, or they would say refurbish the existing venture debt program more than anything else, and just with a specific mandate on climate as well. So there's more and more programs coming into play. In the US, venture debt is way more established than it is in Europe. That's also true. But I think specifically for climate, this will be a up and coming sort of financing in Europe as well. Like another than that, yes, the source of non-dilutive funding are just a lot larger than they used to be. So I've seen these numbers from Climate Tech VC the other day as well, where it's like the funding is down quite a bit on climate tech. But what I think they should have said is also how much the non-dilutive funding went up. I don't have numbers, but I would estimate it kind of the portion that was not taken from investors was probably taken non-dilutive. So entrepreneurs get smarter.
Yeah. I think we are getting a lot of audience questions. I'm handing over to Jacqueline to ask some of them.
Yeah, let's focus on the audience question the last 10 minutes. First question from Daniel, related very much to the discussion that we were just having. The first of a kind gap is getting a lot of attention currently, because that's typically where the really high impact companies struggle to get through the valley of death. And Daniel is asking, what type of developments are we seeing there in terms of funding? What would sort of be the ideal vehicle to bridge this valley of death for deep tech companies? And in what ways can hardware or deep tech startups prepare themselves, from the get-go to make sure that they get such funding? Laurie, could you take a stab at that?
Yeah, I mean, as we mentioned earlier, to me, for the first of its kind manufacturing plants, you need to have a mix of equity, grants, venture debt, equipment financing. Using and raising just equity doesn't make sense. It's way too expensive, and you are going to dilute your company way too much. So that's the mix. Typically, for example, venture debt, you can raise up to a third of the round in venture debt. So meaning if you are, let's say, raising $100 million of equity, you'll be able to raise at least $30 million of venture debt. And then ideally you want to leverage grants, either from Europe or from the US. That's really ideal.
Cool, thank you. Then a question from Odette from Biosphere. She's asking, what is your assessment on the risks of investing in carbon capture and storage, given the latest reports on flagship CCS projects such as Sleipner and Snøhvit in Norway, where the storage part of CCS is really questioned due to extreme changes in the projections and the ability to permanently and safely store captured carbon in geological storage, due to geological instability and challenges projecting real storage capacity and leakage and seepage risks. So basically, carbon capture and storage has some storage challenges, or there's some uncertainty around this. How are you currently looking at CCS type investments and the risks of these, Sebastian?
Sorry.
It's a hard question.
No. For me, my voice is failing me. No, but it's on. First of all, we see carbon as an asset that we also will need in the upcoming decades. So before we sequester, we'd like to actually utilize carbon for any type of future circular hydrocarbons. I think there'll be a lot of that to be had. So at the moment, we haven't done a single sequestration technology investment yet, but we have done adsorption assets. So direct air capture, for example, but also others that can suck carbon out of the atmosphere one way or the other. or directly from a chimney as well. Doesn't have to be, can also be a point source. So that's first of all. And on sequestration, I've seen these reports. We actually, one of our companies working with the Northern Lights projects in Norway, have been doing for quite some time, to essentially use the reservoirs that they build up there for CO2. To be honest, I'm not a geological expert for this either. We've seen quite a few different technology approaches, and but again, we haven't invested into any one of those yet. For us, the priority is first to utilize carbon and then to sequester.
And what are the best current existing ways to utilize that carbon? What are the best use cases of sequestered carbon?
I mean, of captured carbon.
Yeah.
If any hydrocarbon, anything from an e-fuel to plastics to anything. The current petrochemical products, for example. I mean, we will continue to use them for many, many years, in so many different industries, from fragrance to aromatics to to plastics to fuels. I mean, it's all hydrocarbons. There'll be plenty of use case for hydrocarbons in the upcoming future. The point here is to reach again the financial viability of these hydrocarbons. That's a scaling question. I think we are closer to what people believe we are, in terms of scaling to become to price parity with fossil fuels on the on circular hydrocarbons. Typically, it's believed that this is going to be never become viable. I think it's the regulations also in favor here. So we have in the EU, for example, we have the law that as of 24, all the airplanes landing in the EU have to do a quota of e-fuel. That helps e-fuel companies to scale. But yeah, I mean, it's hydrocarbons have huge use spaces. I'm not worried about running out of ideas for hydrocarbons for now.
Cool. A question from Roni is somewhat related to this. Laurie, I would love to ask, what are the thoughts on investing in deep tech solutions doing geoengineering due to the many controversies on the subject? Would you consider geoengineering applications at One, and why or why not?
We would, and we are looking at geoengineering. For example, geothermal energy could be one topic of interest, but of course, always with kind of thinking about the total addressable impact, meaning how much CO2 can be reduced through this geo kind of engineering solution, but also is there any negative impact? And from our perspective, if we see any negative impact, we will not do any investment in the solution. And for carbon storage and carbon capture, actually, we have a pretty strong view here. We've not made any investments in mechanical carbon capture. We've made a couple of investments in biological carbon capture because we believe nature has an incredible ability to sequester carbon through, I mean, forest, mangrove, the ocean. And so we really want to leverage this ability versus mechanical carbon capture, especially from our perspective, direct air capture is an extremely challenging topic. I mean, from a pure unit economics, right now, it's not economically viable. And if it's not economically viable, from a perspective, it's not going to scale. If you look at some of those companies, I'm not going to mention the name of the company, but one of them announced they had built a plant in Europe able to capture the emissions of 800 cars per year. The cost of this facility is $15 million, 15. So I just did the quick calculation. There is 4 billion cars on the planet. If you were to offset just all of the emissions of the cars that are, by the way, less than 5% of global carbon emissions, we would be talking about $22 quadrillion. Not billion, not trillion, quadrillions. Wow. It just doesn't make sense. And I think we should refocus our efforts on nature because nature can store carbon very cheaply at less than $5 per ton. And there is a lot to do there in terms of reforestation and soil health and ocean health.
I know that one of your fellow partners loves to make the claim that beavers have more carbon positive impact than all carbon removal facilities in the world combined today.
Yes.
We're at time, but I would love to hear just in a few words, kind of what is the top climate technology that you're currently looking at or would love to invest in? Like, where are your thoughts at today?
Laurie, you want to go first?
I can quickly. Right now, I'm doing a big deep dive on mining for the energy transition and electrification of everything. There is a big shortage of supply in terms of critical metals like nickel, like cobalt, even lithium is going to be difficult at some point. So trying to find solutions that are going to be less damaging to the planet in terms of extracting those metals while providing the supply to the EV makers and the whole energy transition to make sure we can go there as fast as possible.
Sebastian, very, very briefly.
Yeah, I agree on what Laurie said. We also, our last investment was in that space, actually. Other than that, heat in all its shapes and forms is something we're quite keen on. And renewable heat could be geothermal or anything, but also storing heat and waste heat recovery topics that we are currently quite interested in.
Very exciting. Thank you so much both for joining. I really enjoyed the conversation. And for everybody who wants to learn more about the funds or our fund, you can find it on the website.